This video has been sponsored by Mondly. More on that later. One of the things that makes Tolkien's works so special is the way that he built stories upon stories. He didn't just make maps or write history books. He created a complex, interlacing web of myths and stories of villains and heroes. Aragorn and Arwen aren't just in love. Their tale is an echo of an epic romance from ages past. Tolkien had an incredible understanding of the way that stories work, the way they feed into each other, and how to incorporate real-life myths into his stories without it feeling derivative. My favorite example of this is his lost island city of Numenor. It has everything you could possibly want: a lost utopian society, magic and enchantment and heroes, and a rich moral mythical foundation. Today I want to explore these foundations, to take a look at the real-life mythical inspiration for Numenor, and how Tolkien masterfully weaves together fiction, history, and fantasy to create one of the best stories ever told. We do hear murmurings of the island kingdom of Numenor in The Lord of the Rings. Aragorn and the kingdoms of men are descended from the great race of the Dunedain, but the most complete version of the story can be found in the Silmarillion, in the chapter called Akallabeth. It tells of the aftermath of the War of Wrath, in which the elves, the Valar, and men all had to band together to defeat Morgoth once and for all. Although the good guys had succeeded and Morgoth was imprisoned, Middle-earth had been torn apart by this conflict, scoured by dragons, scorched by Balrogs, and Morgoth's second-in-command, Sauron, was still at large. Rather than leave the faithful men called the Edain behind, just alone and vulnerable on this ruined continent, they decided to give them a mighty gift in thanks for their help in the war. So, off to the west, just a few days' sail from the white shores of Valinor, they raised up an island. Then the Edain set sail upon the deep waters, following the star, and the Valar laid a peace upon the sea for many days, and sent sunlight and a sailing wind, so that the waters glittered before the eyes of the Edain like rippling glass, and the foam flew like snow before the stems of their ships. The Edain came at last over leagues of sea, and saw afar the land that was prepared for them, Andor, the land of gift, shimmering in a golden haze. Then they went up out of the sea, and found a country fair and fruitful, and they were glad. And they called that land Elena, which is starwards, but also Anadune, which is westerness, Numenore, in the High Eldarin tongue. As you can see, Tolkien loved showing off his fictional languages at any given opportunity, and if you'd like to show off your skills with a real-life language, you should check out this video's sponsor, Mondly. Mondly is one of the top 5 language learning apps in the world, and with effective, practical lessons in over 40 different languages, it's not hard to see why. Mondly uses fluent speakers to record their lessons, and they check your pronunciation with AI on the spot so that you can make sure you're learning these languages fluently and naturally. The app is also hands-free, meaning that you can get your learning in even when your hands are busy with stuff like chores or cooking. I think my favorite thing about Mondly is the really wide range of languages that they have available to learn. You can even learn Finnish, which was the language that Tolkien based his Elvish languages on. Right now, Mondly is hosting a summer sale where you can get a 96% discount for lifetime access to all of their languages. You're not going to want to miss out on this, so go ahead and check them out at mondly.app/jessoftheshire or via the link in my description. Thank you so much to Mondly for sponsoring this video, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors when I have them. Numenor seemed, by all definitions, to be a paradise. The land was untouched and fertile, and with the help of the elves, the Edain flourished. From the Eldar, they learned how to craft beautiful things, to build beautiful buildings, how to make ships, and how to sail, and their cities sprung up all across this new island. And before long, the Edain themselves began changing. They grew tall, strong, and immensely wise. The immortality of the elves almost seemed to be rubbing off on them. and these new men, called Dunedain, were known to live for many, many human lifetimes. Over sometimes hundreds of years, a single Dunedain person could learn almost every skill, from blacksmithing to sailing, farming to politics. Numenor was the most profoundly beautiful gift that humanity could have received. For all of their freedom and flourishing, though, they were given by the Valar one unbreakable rule. The lords of Valinor forbade them to sail so far westward that the coasts of Numenor could no longer be seen. The design of Manwë was that the Númenóreans should not be tempted to seek for the Blessed Realm, nor desire to overpass the limits set to their bliss, becoming enamored of the immortality of the Valar and the Eldar, and the lands where all things endure. The Valar knew that for all of their strength, all of their power, men had one weakness, and that was a fear of death. Human beings, even the very long-lived Dunedain, were, from their very conception, destined and doomed to die. Elves lived effectively forever, their souls immutably tied to creation itself, but that was not so for mankind. When they died, their souls passed on out of existence into a new, undiscovered land, ready to fulfill a purpose yet unknown. And the elves saw this mortality as what it was intended to be, a gift. They found immortality exhausting. It gets a little bit complicated here, but they essentially didn't have the same kind of freedom of fate that men were gifted. And in the end, at the very end of all things, when the pillars of creation came tumbling down, the souls of elves would also perish. Thus, they found that human mortality, the fact that human souls would pass on and outside of Arda, the fact that they would continue on for another thing after the end of time, they found that to be a gift. They believed that it was Morgoth's fault, that it was his foul influence that caused men to fear death so much as they did, but I kind of understand why that resentment occurred. Men were born second only to elves, but they were not given their long life, their natural power, their beauty, or their enchantment. Elves had thousands of years, millennia, to live, to learn, to love, to see this world that they've been given, but men were lucky if they got 100. Men feared the unknown, the utter incomprehensibility of what was to come, and they desperately yearned for the certainty of immortality. The ban on travel westward, on men traveling to Valinor, was put there to keep them from temptation. The Valar intended it to be put there as a safety measure for men to protect them from themselves, but it wouldn't be long before men would begin to see this ban as selfishness, as greed. Since they were banned from traveling westward, they struck out back east, stumbling upon the decimated shores of Middle-earth. The men left behind there had become cowering and weak, but when the Númenóreans visited, they did what they could to enlighten them. They taught them how to grow crops once more and how to harvest them. They started teaching them how to build cities and how to govern them. And although the Númenóreans would only appear for brief stints of time, they made a massive impact on Middle-earth. They were viewed as demigods by these poor, broken people, closer to elves than to men. And although in Númenor they managed to create years of harmony, no peace can last forever. The society of Númenor began to fracture, and two major factions formed. Those who wanted to remain faithful to the elves and to the Valar and the promise they had made, and those who wanted to make their own way. Despite these divisions, they were able to hang on to a tenuous balance between these two parties until the death of the 24th king of Númenor, Tar-Palantir. Tar-Palantir had no male children, and so the throne was left to his daughter Miriel, who struggled to hold the two divided halves of the kingdom together. Into this power vacuum stepped a man named Pharazôn. Pharazôn had been out in the world and seen a great deal of it, and was much worse off for it. His heart had become hard and unforgiving, and he began to see the peace of Númenor as stifling He wanted war, he wanted conflict and bloodshed. He forced his way into power, marrying Miriel without her position, and despite what a scandal this was, no one did anything to stop him. It was here where the first major domino in the destruction of Numenor tumbled down. By this time, Sauron had once again revealed himself in Middle-earth, and was slowly chipping away at the strongholds of men. He had long resented Numenor, and was carefully at work dismantling their peace. Now, as king, Ar-Pharazôn caught wind of Sauron's growing power, and he took his brand new, extra strong armies to Middle-earth, and claimed himself to be king of all men, not just Numenor, knowing that Sauron would have to come out and face him. At the mere sight of this new, improved army coming to the shores of Middle-earth, most of Sauron's army fled, and he was forced to surrender to Ar-Pharazôn, who took him as prisoner. And despite the fact that this looked like a victory, this would be yet another deep crack in the foundations of Numenor. By bringing Sauron the Deceiver into the very heart of their kingdom, the Númenorians had unknowingly swallowed a bitter poison. Yet, such was the cunning of Sauron's mind and mouth, and the strength of his hidden will, that ere 3 years had passed, he had become closest to the secret counsels of the king, for flattery, sweet as honey, was ever on his tongue, and knowledge he had of many things yet unrevealed to men, and, seeing the favor that he had of their lord, all the counselors began to fawn upon him, save one alone. Then slowly a change came over the land, and the hearts of the elf friends were sorely troubled, and many fell away out of fear. And although those that remained still called themselves the faithful, their enemies named them rebels. Sauron preyed upon the Dunedain fear of death and their feelings of inadequacy towards the elves and the Valar. They were easy prey, primed by years of resentment, of festering ill will, and Sauron took advantage of this and used it to convince them that the one god, Ilúvatar, was not truly as all-powerful as the Valar claimed. Rather, it was the Dark One, Morgoth, who truly held the power. And while the great gift of Ilúvatar was the thing that men feared the most, death, Morgoth rewarded his faithful servants quite handsomely. For years, the only thing that held back the Númenorian elites from full-on rebellion against the elves and the Valar was fear. Fear of the power of the Valar, fear of retribution. But now, with the Deceiver whispering in their ears, they were willing to try acting recklessly. And their first target was the great white tree, Nimloth. Nimloth had been given to them as a gift by the Valar. It stood and grew beautifully in the center of the palace as a sign of their mutual respect, their mutual goodwill. But now, with that relationship more strained than it ever was before, Sauron tried to convince Ar-Pharazôn to cut it down, to sever that connection completely. The few remaining faithful left in Númenor caught wind of this, and Isildur, the son of Elendil, snuck into the palace at night to try and steal a fruit from Nimloth. He very nearly lost his life doing this stunt, but the seed was safe, which was all the better because very shortly after that, Nimloth was cut down by Ar-Pharazôn. Sauron took the broken pieces of Nimloth and used them to start the first fire in his new temple to Morgoth. Thereafter the fire and smoke went up without ceasing, for the power of Sauron daily increased, and in that temple, with spilling of blood and torment and great wickedness, men made sacrifice to Melkor, that he should release them from death, and most often from among the faithful they chose their victims. But for all this, death did not depart from the land. Rather, it came sooner, and more often, and in many dreadful guises. In just a few short years, Númenor had descended into utter depravity. They sacrificed both animals and humans, burning blood offerings in the name of their new lord, Morgoth. They were richer than ever, but their wealth made them cruel. Rather than bringing aid and wisdom to the poor people of Middle-earth, they raided and enslaved them. Their utopian haven had been bloated so far by their own pride, their own ego, that it had become a tyranny. And yet, none of this blood and brutality was staving off the inevitable. Despite their human sacrifices, the Númenóreans were no closer to escaping death, and even their king, the great Ar-Pharazôn, closest to Sauron, was beginning to feel the years catching up with him. And that right there was the opportunity that Sauron had been waiting for. He suggested to the king that for truly great men, for the kings and lords of Númenor, death could be avoidable. Sure, the blood sacrifice hadn't had any effect yet, but the elves had already discovered the secret to immortality. And if they weren't going to be convinced to share it, why not use the military might and glory of Númenor to take it? Amandil, the father of Elendil, heard of these vile plans and decided that he would need to warn the Valar of this oncoming attack. In order to do this, he knew that he would have to break the rule. He would have to sail over and set foot in Valinor, and he figured that he would probably die from this infraction. But he did it anyway. He was willing to sacrifice his life to prevent complete disaster. He forced his son Elendil and his grandson Isildur to gather together any of the remaining faithful left in Númenor and to take the seed of Nimloth onto their boats. He knew that Númenor would probably not be safe for very much longer. Amandil sailed off to Valinor and was never seen again, but it does seem that his warning got through. As if the Valar were trying to warn them, to ward them off, terrible weather and great storms fell upon Númenor. A fiery bolt smote the dome of the temple and shore it asunder, and it was wreathed in flame. But the temple itself was not shaken, and Sauron stood there upon the pinnacle and defied the lightning and was unharmed. And in that hour, men called him a god and did all that he would. Rather than seeing this as the warning that it was, the Númenóreans took this as divine punishment, as a first strike, and they were more than ready to strike back. Armed fully for battle, the Númenóreans took to their ships and sailed west. And at last Ar-Pharazôn came even to Aman, the Blessed Realm and the coasts of Valinor, and still all was silent, and doom hung by a thread. For Ar-Pharazôn wavered at the end, and almost he turned back. His heart misgave him when he looked upon the soundless shores and saw Taniquetil shining, whiter than the snow, colder than death, silent, immutable, terrible as the shadow of the light of Ilúvatar. But pride was now his master, and at last he left his ship and strode upon the shore, claiming the land for his own, if none should do battle for it. As it turned out, there would be no need for battle. Númenor had been given as a gift given with one condition. Despite Sauron's manipulation, Ar-Pharazôn, the king of Númenor, had willingly chosen to break this one rule, and the retribution was swift. Ilúvatar showed forth his power, and he changed the fashion of the world. And a great chasm opened in the sea between Númenor and the Deathless Lands, and the waters flowed down into it, and the noise and smoke of the cataracts went up to heaven, and the world was shaken. And all the fleets of the Númenóreans were drawn down into the abyss, and they were drowned and swallowed up forever. Even the island city itself would not be able to escape God's judgment. Then suddenly fire burst from the Meneltarma, the holy mountain, and there came a mighty wind and a tumult of the earth, and the sky reeled and the hills slid, and Númenor went down into the sea, with all its children and its wives, its maidens and its ladies proud. and all its gardens, and its halls and its towers, its tombs and its riches, and its jewels and its webs, and its things painted and carven, and its laughter, and its mirth and its music, its wisdom and its lore. They vanished forever. And last of all, the mounting wave, green and cold and plumed with foam climbing over the land, took to its bosom Tarmiriel, the queen, fairer than silver or ivory or pearls. Too late she strove to ascend the steep ways of the Meneltarma to the holy place, for the waters overtook her, and her cry was lost in the roaring of the wind. By the time that the seas had settled, Numenor was no more. Iluvatar had literally reshaped the planet from flat to round, and Numenor was swallowed whole. The sole survivor of Numenor was Sauron, whose soul didn't necessarily need to be tied to his body. His work complete and Numenor destroyed, his soul went back to Middle-earth and holed itself up, preparing for his next strike. Fortunately, Elendil, Isildur, and the remaining faithful survived, and they sailed to Middle-earth. There, they led the existing peoples of Middle-earth to rebuild and to reshape Middle-earth, creating the great kingdoms of men. Although it was gone, Numenor and what it represented would never truly leave the minds of the Dunedain and their descendants. It was, all at once, a gift, a holy land, a dream, and also a nightmare. Once a relic, a shining symbol of the height of men's possibility, it became a temple to their most deplorable traits. Legend has it that the peak of the holy mountain, Meneltarma, may still rest somewhere above the water, forming a little island, somewhere out in the western seas, but despite their best efforts, it has never been found. Instead, Numenor will forever remain a story, a symbol for the heights of man's potential and the utter depths of its depravity. I wouldn't be surprised if just hearing that story, multiple bells were ringing in your head. Despite being an original and quite effective tale, the Akalabeth, which means the downfall of Numenor, pulls from multiple different mythic inspirations. The first and possibly most recognizable and popular one is, of course, the story of Atlantis. And we can tell just from background knowledge that this was definitely an intentional parallel. After all, the Sindarin name for Numenor is Atalante, and in multiple places throughout his letters, Tolkien calls the Akalabeth his Atlantis story. And the superficial comparison is pretty obvious. The tale of Atlantis was originally, in the first place it was written, quite simple. It was an island created by the gods to house the demigod children of Poseidon. On this island, they flourished and became a shining beacon of wisdom, enlightenment, and wealth. However, just like in Numenor, this peace wore thin. The blood of Poseidon was slowly bred out, and as they became more human, people became more greedy, selfish, and cruel. Before long, the gods decided they had sunk too far down into their vices and called down natural cataclysms to wipe Atlantis off the map completely. So that is all a good and interesting comparison, but the true value of the Atlantis-Numenor comparison comes from the fact that the story is untrue. Sure, of course, every couple of years the History Channel comes out with yet another documentary claiming that this time they found the lost city of Atlantis, but that's clearly a cash grab and just completely empirically incorrect. The first time Atlantis was written about, it was written about as fiction by the Greek philosopher Plato, and it appears in 2 of his dialogues. Back in the day, Socratic dialogues were pretty popular amongst Greek philosophers, who would use them as a way to express their ideas in an easier to interpret format. They play out like these scenes, like scripts between 2 characters with 2 differing viewpoints as they discuss their ideas and come to conclusions. It's basically like the equivalent of using a skit for a project in class instead of a PowerPoint presentation. And even back then, Plato wrote this as an intentional work of fiction. It was never intended to be an actual historical account. Rather, it was a symbol. It was a parable showing how high man could fly and how far they could fall. But now, just because Atlantis is distinctly and specifically untrue, that doesn't necessarily mean that the story of Numenor is also untrue. Well, it is technically, because it's fiction and it was invented by a guy in the 50s, but you know what I mean. Inside the fictional world of Arda, in the fictional context, I think it's fair to say that the story of Numenor could have very likely happened. It could have been real history. However, even though it is maybe history, it is also a story. It is also a tale being used to teach a lesson. And that story is that of the ultimate tragedy, something that Atlantis and Numenor do a beautiful job of telling. The traditional Greek tragedy begins by presenting the audience with a character who's on top of the world. Take Oedipus, the king, for example. He's the king, his people love him, he's got a great family, he's rich, he's powerful, he's cool, and he's just doing as well as a person can do. But over the course of the play, over the course of this tragedy, we see this wonderful life being torn to pieces. He finds out that his entire life is a lie. He accidentally killed his father, and the woman that he's married to, who he has had children with, is actually his mother. And this story works. This fall from grace is so powerful and so cathartic because of how far he was able to fall. It's because of how incredible his life was and how incredibly, terribly it collapsed around him. Both Atlantis and Numenor follow this same structure. Certainly, mankind has always had a desire to create a utopia. We always want to believe that things could be better, that things could be perfect, and in both of these ancient civilizations, they were able to achieve that perfection. They became everything that a human society could ever want to be. Then these stories in that very same stroke show us just how impossible our utopian dreams are. So long as humans are humans, wealth will always be a slippery slope to greed. Greatness always leads you perilously close to pride. We tell and retell the story of Atlantis, and Tolkien created the story of Numenor because it displays to us the fundamental human dichotomy. We want perfection, we want greatness, but we know that it's never really healthy for us to achieve that. Telling ourselves stories like this has always been important because it manages our expectations. It means that although we strive for progress, we strive to achieve more, we're always mindful of where all of that progress could lead us. But Atlantis wasn't the only myth that inspired the Numenorean tragedy. Despite the sorrow, the pain, the tragedy inherent in the story, there is also a sense of wonder, of enchantment. I believe that Tolkien found some of the inspiration for this from more European sources, such as King Arthur's Avalon. Though it was entirely shrouded in mystery and rarely mentioned in the older Arthurian stories, the land of Avalon was said to be the magical home of the sorceress Morgan Le Fay. On its enchanted, shimmering shores, supposedly the sword of King Arthur was forged, and he was later brought there for magical healing. Undoubtedly, the downtrodden, very average people of Middle-earth would have looked upon Numenor as an Avalon, an offshore distant land of magic and mystery. In the Dunedain, the people of Numenor, I can also see an echo of one of my favorite parts of Irish mythology, the Tuatha De Danann. The term Tuatha De Danann means the children of Danu. Danu being an early Irish goddess that we honestly don't know a whole lot about. What we do know is that her children, the Tuatha De Danann, first arrived on Irish shores on ships made of rolling fog. They were tall, they were beautiful, they were skilled masters of every craft. They had come to Ireland from a distant land of sorcery, and they used their skills to cleanse Ireland of the Firbolg, its previous inhabitants, to claim it for themselves. Their exploits make up some of the most well-known parts of the Irish mythic cycle, and they reigned with a strong hand until they were finally defeated by the people that would become the inhabitants of modern Ireland today. And the legend has it that the Tuatha Dé Danann never really died, they just faded. In fact, they're still there today, just in smaller and more mischievous form, hanging out in hills and fairy circles, or the mystic, ever-youthful land of Tir na Nog. Humans love the idea that somewhere far off in the world, even if it's in a distant and yet undiscovered land, that magic is real. Somewhere far off, there are these enchanted beings that any day now could step foot on our shore. To the people of Middle-earth, the Dunedain were their Tuatha Dé, the whisperings of the far-off island was their Avalon. These stories gave them the escape that they needed. It gave them something to believe in. That even though their lives were painful and full of toil and struggling, that somewhere there was a bit of magic just waiting to slip through into the borders of real life. Numenor was shaped out of this mass of mythical ideas, out of the impossible nostalgia of a lost utopia, out of the promise of enchantment just over the rainbow. But there is one more story that I think lies even deeper in the bones of Tolkien's Numenor, and that is the Christian Bible. Tolkien was a devout Catholic, and his Middle-earth was completely shaped by his religious beliefs and the stories that created them. And we can already see that Númenor is presented as a sort of Garden of Eden. The men and women are gifted with everything they could possibly want, untarnished and perfect, except for one rule. In the case of Adam and Eve, this rule was quite simple. The Lord God gave man this order: you are free to eat from any of the trees of the garden, except the tree of knowledge of good and bad. From that tree you shall not eat. The moment you eat from it, you are surely doomed to die. Tolkien paralleled this beautifully with the Numenorean ban on westward travel. The ideas are even presented in a structurally similar way. The rule is put in place, the boundary is set in place, and then the reasoning for it is immediately explained. For Adam and Eve, it's explained that eating of the fruit of this tree would ultimately lead to their death. For the Numenoreans, it would fuel their already unhealthy fixation on immortality. It's not a one-for-one adaptation, of course. Tolkien famously did not like allegory, but you can see where Tolkien was pulling inspiration. He wasn't replicating the story, he was mirroring it. He was placing his human beings, his early Dunedain, in the same place as early biblical man. Then, in both stories, this one rule, the one rule that they had put in place to help them, to keep them safe, it was broken with the help of a wily tempter. For the Numenoreans, this was Sauron, who infested the heart of their kingdom, preying upon their deepest set fears in order to tempt them to sin. In the Bible, this voice comes from a serpent. Now the serpent was the most cunning of all the animals that the Lord God had made. The serpent asked the woman, "Did God really tell you not to eat from any of the trees in the garden?" The woman answered the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. It is only about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, 'You shall not eat it, or even touch it, lest you die.'" But the serpent said to the woman, "You will certainly not die. No, God knows well that the moment you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like gods who know what is good and what is bad." Again, although not identical, we see the echoes of this original temptation in Sauron's urging towards sin. He works insidiously, not demanding obedience or attacking outright. Rather, he twists natural good human desires. He preys upon deeply set fears, turning people one by one against the very people that gave them that paradise. Then, as Adam and Eve ate the fruit, so the Númenóreans set foot upon Valinor. And in both cases, the fallout is catastrophic. Then the Lord God said, "See, the man has become like one of us, knowing what is good and what is bad. Therefore he must not be allowed to put out his hand to take the fruit of the tree of life also, and thus eat of it and live forever. The Lord God therefore banished him from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he had been taken." For both Adam and Eve, and the Númenóreans, the punishment is not given just for the sake of punishment. Adam and Eve had to be banished to keep them from gaining immortality in their fallen state and staying trapped like that forever, and the Númenóreans had to be cleansed before they caused further harm. And yet, in both tales, the ramifications of this fall would be felt not just by those who had fallen, but by every subsequent generation. In the Bible, God reveals that man will now have to toil for everything that he wants, things that were once freely given, and that women will now have incredible pain in childbirth. The echoes of this original sin would be felt by every single one of their offspring, every human being, until the very end. In the tale of Númenor, although Ar-Pharazôn and his men are technically the only ones stepping foot on the shores of Valinor, every unfaithful Numenorean feels the ramifications of this decision. The women, the children, the very foundations of their life are utterly destroyed. But there is another story from Genesis that rings through in the story of Númenor, one Tolkien even referenced in his letters. He referred to his Akalabeth as Noachian, as in Noah, best known for his role in the flood. The story goes that since the days of Adam and Eve, mankind has struggled to find peace. When the Lord saw how great was man's wickedness on earth, and how no desire that his heart conceived was ever anything but evil, he regretted that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was grieved. So the Lord said, "I will wipe out from the earth the men whom I have created, and not only the men, but also the beasts, and the creeping things, and the birds of the air, for I am sorry that I made them." But Noah found favor with the Lord. Noah was God's chosen one, a righteous man in the midst of all this roiling evil. And so God commanded Noah to build a giant boat, to put his family in it, and to fill it with male and female members of every animal on earth. Although God had created the world good, man had infested it with unthinkable evil. And so once this seed of humanity, of creation, was safe, the rain began to fall. Higher and higher above the earth rose the waters, until all the highest mountains everywhere were submerged, the crest rising 15 cubits higher than the submerged mountains. All creatures that stirred on earth perished, birds, cattle, wild animals, and all that swarmed on the earth, as well as all mankind. Everything on dry land with the faintest breath of life in its nostrils died out. The Lord wiped out every living thing on earth. Man and cattle, the creeping things, and the birds of the air, all were wiped out from the earth. Only Noah and those with him on the ark were left. This righteous destruction is hauntingly captured in the Cataclysm of Numenor. But it's not all about death. We can also see a biblical parallel in the careful preservation of life. Just like Noah and his ark, Elendil and his heirs took the last remaining faithful and the seed of Nimloth and escaped to their ships. Armed with this symbol of goodwill, this promise of faithfulness between elves and men, they set about creating a new civilization in Middle-earth. For Tolkien, the inclusion of these biblical themes was key because it shaped the moral authority of his stories. He wasn't just blindly myth-making, recalling the tales of Atlantis and Avalon because they're nice and glamorous and people like hearing them. He was pulling in threads that he truly believed were important. He was telling this story with ideas and morals that he truly believed in. Concepts of biblical justice, of God's endless desire to forgive, of the fallen nature of man. Numenor wasn't just a cute little parable. It wasn't a mirage of far-off magic. For Tolkien, it was real. And just as the Bible is believed to be the real story of salvation history still being lived out today, so the echoes of Numenor carry into the modern day of Middle-earth and of the Lord of the Rings. Aragorn is not just trying to be a good king and to treat his people well, he is trying to redeem the original sin of Numenor. The unifying of forces between elves and men isn't just a convenient alliance, it is the reinstating of a millennia-old covenant. Just as the biblical tales of Genesis have shaped modern Christianity, the tale of the lost island city of Numenor has shaped the morality, the society of Middle-earth since it first tumbled into the ocean. In a way, I think that The Lord of the Rings can be explained as being a story about stories. Tolkien had this incredible understanding of the way that our myths distill our highest and most profound hopes, the ways that they encompass, express, and explore our deepest worries. And the tale of Númenor, wrought out of humanity's most quintessential myths, is an excellent example of this. But don't let me make all of that sound too clinical or too scholarly. At the end of the day, Tolkien told the story of Númenor because it mattered to him. In his letters, he references what he calls his Atlantis haunting. This legend or myth or dim memory of some ancient history has always troubled me. In sleep, I had the dreadful dream of the ineluctable wave, either coming out of the quiet sea or coming in towering over the green inlands. It still occurs occasionally, though now exorcised by writing about it. It always ends by surrender, and I awake gasping out of deep water. Númenor was created because it was something that Tolkien was afraid of. It was a dream that he believed had been handed down to him, passed on in some kind of Dune-esque genetic memory. And while scientifically that can't be proven as a real thing that happens, as far as I'm aware, it is quite real in the realm of stories. None of the ideas of Númenor that we've explored in this video, or that anyone else has explored, are unique. Almost every human society has invented their own lost civilization. We have Shangri-La, El Dorado, and of course, Atlantis. We see stories about superhuman, demigod-like, beautiful tall people in almost every mythology. The idea that early human beings committed an original sin, which has echoed down in its effect through the generations, exists everywhere, from Pandora's box to Prometheus to, of course, the Bible. And then, perhaps the most resounding example of this, almost every civilization from around the world tells the story of a great flood that wiped out nearly all life. And I'm not saying that all of these things are true, that lost civilizations are real, or that there was actually a flood. We just always reinvent these stories because they're the things that we wonder about, the things we hope for, the things that we fear. And Tolkien's tale of the downfall of Númenor so beautifully combines these themes. He so dexterously incorporates these fundamental human ideas that it's almost hard to believe that this wasn't already a human story. It was Tolkien's goal with The Lord of the Rings to create a new mythos for England, and he only succeeded at that so well because he let these tales grow organically, sinking their roots deep down into the clay of storytelling. Tolkien didn't just use stories. He didn't chop them up and then strip them for parts. He was able to find out the very core and center of them. He was able to narrow in on exactly why these stories had been invented and reinvented in the past, and he took that core, that shimmering little ember, and blew it into a bonfire. That is the true genius of Tolkien's Numenor and the absolute power of his fantastical myth-making. I strongly suspect that there are quite a few mythic comparisons for Numenor that I missed in this video, and if that's the case, please let me know in the comments because I have loved diving deeper and deeper into the roots of this story. I think that these kind of more contained stories that we see in the Silmarillion, like the Akalabeth or like Beren and Luthien, they're so interesting to me because it really feels like Tolkien was kind of trying on genres for size. It shows off just how great his range as an author was. If this video got you thinking about stories in a new way, or you liked it, consider giving it a like because that really helps me out. And of course, consider subscribing to join this community because I make videos here almost every single week and I'd love to have you. I did mention this in a community post, but in case you haven't seen that, I am this summer going to be taking some time off of my day job to try out doing YouTube full time. I don't entirely know how it's gonna go. I don't know if it's gonna be permanent, but for now, I am so excited to, first of all, like breathe and have weekends again, but also to dive deeper into these stories and do a little bit more on my Patreon. So I just wanted to extend a huge thank you to all of you for being the ones that made that possible because it's really cool and I am so excited for the stuff I have coming. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.